Princess Kira stood on the highest balcony of the Crystal Palace and watched the sky turn colors she had never seen before because something was coming through the atmosphere, and it was burning bright like a falling star, but it was not falling at all. The twin suns of Eldrabeth were setting behind the mountain peaks, and the whole capital city below her was starting to panic, because in 10,000 years of elven history, nothing had ever entered their world without permission, and their shields should have kept everything out beside her. The two dragons stirred from their rest, and Ash lifted his massive gray head while Ember stretched her crimson wings, and both of them sensed that their mistress was troubled, and they moved closer. To offer comfort, Kira had raised these dragons from eggs when she was just a child, and now they were fully grown and loyal only to her, and together they had flown across every province of the empire, and she trusted them more than she trusted most of the nobles in her father's court. The strange object in the sky was getting closer now, and Kira could see that it was made of metal and had lights blinking along its surface, and she realized with a shock that it was a ship, but not like any ship her people had ever built. The alarm bells began ringing throughout the city, and she heard her father's voice booming through the palace calling for the royal guard and demanding that the Council of Elders assemble immediately, and Kira knew she should go to him. But she could not look away from the ship. It was descending toward the landing fields outside the city walls, and moving with such precision that whoever controlled it clearly knew exactly what they were doing, and Kira felt her heart beating faster because this was either the beginning of an invasion or the answer to prayers she had not known she was praying. 3 weeks ago, the southern colonies had sent desperate messages saying that a blight had destroyed their crops and that people were starving. And the council had debated for days about what to do, and in the end they had done nothing, because the southern colonies were far away, and mostly populated by lower classes. Kira had argued with her father, and with Lord Valen, who led the council, and she had begged them to send food and medicine, but they had told her that a princess should not concern herself with such matters, and that the colonies would recover on their own as they always did. But then someone had sent out a distress signal into space, and Kira did not know who had done it because it was forbidden to contact other worlds. And the Elven Empire had isolated itself for thousands of years, believing that they were superior to all other races. Now it seemed that someone had answered that signal, and Kira felt a strange mixture of hope and fear rising in her chest, because everything was about to change, and she did not know if that change would save her people or destroy them. She climbed onto Ash's back and signaled for Ember to follow, and together they launched from the balcony and flew toward the landing fields, because if these strangers were coming to her world, then she wanted to be the first to meet them. Wind rushed past her face, and her long silver hair streamed behind her, and below she could see the royal guard assembling with their weapons ready, and she knew they were preparing for war. But something told her that war was not what these visitors wanted. The ship touched down gently on the landing field, and steam hissed from its sides, and Kira circled above it with her dragons and studied every detail because she had never seen technology like this, and it made the greatest achievements of elven engineering look simple by comparison. A door opened in the side of the ship and a ramp extended downward, and Kira held her breath, waiting to see what kind of creatures would emerge and whether they would be hostile or friendly. The first figure that appeared was smaller than she expected and walked on 2 legs and wore a dark blue uniform with symbols she did not recognize. And when the figure removed its helmet, Kira saw with surprise that it was a human woman with short brown hair and warm brown eyes. Kira had read about humans in the ancient texts, but those texts said that humans were a primitive species, barely capable of space travel, and certainly not capable of building ships that could cross between star systems. But clearly those texts had been wrong. The human woman stood at the bottom of the ramp and looked up at the dragons circling above, and instead of showing fear, she smiled and raised one hand in what seemed to be a gesture of peace and greeting. Kira made a decision that she knew would anger her father and the council, but she guided Ash down to land on the field about 50 feet from the ship, and Ember landed beside them, and both dragons positioned themselves protectively around their mistress. The human woman walked forward slowly with her hands visible and empty of weapons, and she stopped about 20 feet away and spoke in a language that Kira did not understand at first. But then she touched something on her collar and spoke again. This time Kira understood the words because the device was translating, and the human said that her name was Lauren Hayes, and that she was the captain of the ship Wanderer, and that her crew had received a distress call from this world and had come to offer assistance. Kira studied this Lauren Hayes and saw confidence in the way she stood and kindness in her eyes, and something about her presence made Kira feel like she could trust her, even though they had just met. She dismounted from Ash and walked forward and said that she was Princess Kira, daughter of King Aldrich and guardian of the Crystal Realm, and that she welcomed them to Eldraveth. Though she did not know if that welcome would last once her father and the council arrived, Lauren smiled and said that she understood and that her people came in peace and that they had brought food and medicine and supplies that might help with the crisis in the southern colonies. Kira felt something shift in her chest, because this stranger had crossed the stars to help people she had never met, while Kira's own father and his council had refused to help their own citizens, and she wondered what that said about her empire. Behind her she heard the thunder of hooves and knew that the royal guard was arriving, and she turned to see her father riding at the head of a column of soldiers, with Lord Valen beside him, and both of them looked furious. King Aldrich dismounted and strode forward and demanded to know who these intruders were and why they had violated elven space, and his hand was on the hilt of his sword. But before Kira could answer, Lauren stepped forward and bowed respectfully, and repeated what she had told Kira about coming to help. And she did so with such calm dignity that even the king seemed taken aback. Lord Valen, however, was not impressed, and he declared that the Elven Empire needed no help from lesser species, and that these humans should leave immediately before they were forced to leave. Kira saw Lauren's jaw tighten at the insult, but the human captain kept her composure and said that they would leave if ordered, but that people were dying in the southern colonies, and her crew could save lives if given the chance. The king looked at his daughter and then at Lord Valen, and then back at the human captain, and Kira could see him weighing pride against practicality, and she held her breath waiting for his decision. King Aldrich finally spoke and said that the humans could stay for 3 days to deliver their supplies to the southern colonies, but they would be watched at all times, and if they attempted anything suspicious, they would be destroyed, and Lauren agreed to these terms without hesitation. Lord Valen protested and said that allowing outsiders into their world was a mistake that would weaken their empire, but the king silenced him with a look and declared that the matter was settled, and that Princess Kira would serve as the official liaison to the human crew. Kira felt both honored and nervous because this meant she would spend time with these strangers and learn about them, and part of her was excited by that prospect while another part worried about what she might discover. The king and Lord Valen returned to the palace with most of the guard, but a dozen soldiers remained to watch the human ship, and Kira approached Lauren again and said that she would show her crew where they could set up their base of operations. Lauren called to her ship and 5 more humans emerged carrying equipment and supplies, and Kira noticed that they were diverse in appearance with different skin colors and features, and they all seemed to work together with easy familiarity. One of them was a tall woman with dark skin and close-cropped hair, who introduced herself as Captain Riley Chen and said she was the ship's doctor, and another was a younger woman with red hair named Megan Torres, who handled communications and navigation. There was also a man named Kevin Park who managed the ship's systems, and an older woman named Janet Morrison who coordinated logistics, and finally a quiet man named Carlos Diaz, who served as the security officer. Kira led them to a building near the landing field that had once been used for storage, and Lauren looked around and said it would work perfectly, and her crew immediately began unloading crates of food and medical supplies. While they worked, Kira watched them and noticed how they spoke to each other with respect and even made jokes and laughed together, and there was none of the rigid hierarchy she was used to seeing in her father's court. Lauren noticed her watching and came over and asked if she would like to see inside the ship. And Kira felt a thrill of curiosity because she had always been fascinated by technology, and this ship represented knowledge far beyond what her people possessed. Ash and Ember followed them up the ramp, and Lauren did not seem bothered by having 2 massive dragons aboard her ship, and she showed Kira the bridge where screens displayed information in languages and symbols Kira did not recognize. Lauren explained that her people came from a federation of worlds where dozens of species lived and worked together, and that humans had learned long ago that cooperation and diversity made them stronger. And Kira found this concept strange, because her people believed that isolation and purity made them strong. They walked through corridors lined with equipment, and Lauren pointed out the medical bay where Riley would treat patients and the storage holds that were packed with supplies. And everywhere Kira looked, she saw efficiency and purpose. Lauren showed her the living quarters where the crew slept, and Kira was surprised to see that the captain's room was barely larger than the others. And when she commented on this, Lauren laughed and said that rank did not mean luxury. In human culture, they ended up in a small room that Lauren called the observation deck, and it had a window that looked out at the stars, and Lauren told Kira that she had grown up on a space station and had always dreamed of exploring new worlds. Kira sat beside her and admitted that she had always felt trapped by her position as princess, and that she was expected to marry Prince Theron of the Northern Kingdoms to secure an alliance, and that she had no choice in the matter. Lauren looked at her with such genuine sympathy that Kira felt tears forming in her eyes, and the human captain said that where she came from, people chose their own paths, and that forced marriages were considered wrong. Kira asked what it was like to have such freedom, and Lauren thought for a moment and said that freedom came with responsibility, because when you could choose your own path, you also had to accept the consequences of your choices. They talked for hours, and Kira learned about human worlds, where leaders were elected by the people, and where even the poorest citizen had rights and protections. And Lauren learned about the Elven Empire, and its long history, and its rigid social structure. When Kira finally returned to the palace, the twin suns were setting again, and she realized she had spent the entire day with Lauren and her crew, and she felt something she had not felt in years, which was hope. Her father summoned her to his chambers and demanded a report, and Kira told him that the humans seemed sincere in their desire to help, and that they had already begun organizing supply shipments to the southern colonies. Lord Valen was there too, and he said that the humans were clearly trying to gain favor so they could exploit Eldriveth's resources, and that Kira was being naive to trust them. Kira defended Lauren and her crew and said that they had shown nothing but respect and competence, but her father warned her not to get too attached because the humans would be leaving in 3 days and things would return to normal. That night, Kira lay in her bed unable to sleep because her mind kept returning to the conversations she had with Lauren and the glimpses she had gotten of a different way of living, and she wondered if her empire's way was really the best way. The next morning, she returned to the landing field and found Lauren's crew already hard at work, loading transport vehicles with supplies and preparing to make the journey to the southern colonies. Lauren asked if Kira would like to come with them, and Kira immediately agreed, because she wanted to see the colonies for herself, and because she wanted to spend more time with this fascinating human captain. They flew south in one of the human transport vehicles, and Kira brought Ash and Ember, who flew alongside them, and the journey took several hours and gave Kira time to talk more with Lauren about human culture and values. When they arrived at the first colony town, Kira was shocked by what she saw, because the ancient texts had always described the colonies as prosperous and content. But instead she found crumbling buildings and people who looked thin and tired. Riley set up a medical station and began treating the sick while the others distributed food, and Kira watched as Lauren knelt beside children and elderly people and spoke to them with such kindness that many of them began to cry. A local leader named Elder Mira approached Kira and thanked her for bringing help, but also said quietly that the capital had ignored their requests for aid for months and that people had died waiting for help that never came. Kira felt shame burning in her chest because she had known the colonies were suffering, but she had not realized how bad things truly were, and she had allowed herself to be convinced by her father and the council that the problem was not urgent. Lauren came to stand beside her and put a gentle hand on her arm and said that Kira was not responsible for the choices others had made, but that she could choose now to make things better. They worked through the day helping the colony, and as evening approached, Lauren suggested they stay overnight instead of returning to the capital. And Kira agreed because she wanted to understand what life was really like outside the palace walls. That night they sat around a fire with the colonists and listened to their stories, and Kira learned about families torn apart by poverty and children who had never seen the Crystal Palace and people who had given up hope that anyone in the capital cared about them. Lauren shared stories too about human worlds she had visited and problems her people had faced and overcome, and the colonists listened with fascination because they had never met anyone from another world. Kira realized that Lauren was showing her something important, which was that connection between people mattered more than status or species, and that listening to others and treating them with dignity was the foundation of real leadership. When they finally retired to rest, Lauren and Kira sat together under the stars, and Kira admitted that her eyes had been opened and that she could not go back to seeing her world the way she had before. Lauren smiled and said that was the first step toward creating change, and then she reached over and took Kira's hand, and the princess felt her heart skip because no one had ever touched her with such simple affection. The next 2 days passed too quickly for Kira because she spent every moment she could with Lauren and the human crew as they traveled to different colony towns and delivered supplies and medical care. Everywhere they went, Kira saw the same pattern, which was people who had been neglected by the Empire living in conditions that no one in the capital would tolerate. And she began to understand that her father's kingdom was not as great as she had been taught to believe. On the final evening, before the humans were scheduled to leave, Kira invited Lauren to the palace gardens for a private dinner, and she wanted to show the human captain the beauty of her world. But also to have time alone with her. Lauren arrived as the twin suns were setting, and she wore a simple dress instead of her uniform, and Kira thought she looked beautiful with the golden light catching in her hair. They walked through gardens filled with flowers that glowed in the twilight and fountains that sang with musical tones, and ash and ember followed at a distance, giving them privacy, but staying close enough to protect their mistress. Lauren said the gardens were the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and Kira laughed and said that beauty was easier to maintain than justice, and Lauren nodded and said that was true on many worlds, not just this one. They sat beside a fountain, and servants brought food, but Kira barely tasted it, because all her attention was focused on Lauren and the way the human captain looked at her with such genuine interest and respect. Kira asked Lauren what would happen after she left, and Lauren said her ship would return to Federation space to resupply and then continue their mission of exploration and contact with new species. The thought of Lauren leaving made Kira feel a pain in her chest that she had not expected, and she realized that in just 3 days, this human woman had become more important to her than people she had known her whole life. Lauren must have seen something in her face because she reached across the table and took Kira's hand again, and said that she would miss her too, and that meeting Kira had been the best part of this entire journey. Kira gathered her courage and said something she had never said to anyone before, which was that she did not want to marry Prince Theron, and that she did not want to spend her life following rules she did not believe in. Lauren squeezed her hand and said that Kira was brave and strong, and that she deserved to live a life she chose for herself, and then Lauren leaned forward and kissed her gently on the lips. Kira felt like the world had stopped spinning, because no one had ever kissed her before, and certainly not like this with such tenderness and respect, and when they pulled apart, she saw that Lauren was smiling. They talked long into the night about possibilities and dreams and what it might mean to challenge an empire that had stood unchanged for 10,000 years, and when they finally said goodnight, Kira felt both terrified and exhilarated. But Lord Valen had been watching, and he had seen the princess with the human captain, and he went immediately to King Aldrich and told him that his daughter was being corrupted by these outsiders. The king summoned Kira the next morning and demanded to know if she had developed feelings for the human captain, and Kira knew that lying would only make things worse, so she admitted that she had, and that Lauren had helped her see her world more clearly. Her father's face turned red with anger, and he said that she was a princess of the Elven Empire, and that she could not disgrace herself by forming attachments to lesser beings, and that she would marry Prince Theron as planned. Kira stood her ground and said that she would not marry Theron, and that she had begun to question whether the Empire's ways were just, and her father looked at her as if she had become a stranger. Lord Valen stepped forward and said that the humans had clearly poisoned the princess's mind, and that they should be expelled immediately, and all contact with them should be forbidden. The king agreed, and ordered that Lauren and her crew must leave within the hour, and that Kira was confined to her chambers until the wedding to Prince Theron, which would take place in 1 month. Kira tried to argue, but guards surrounded her and escorted her back to her tower, and she heard the heavy door lock behind her, and realized she was a prisoner in her own home. From her window she could see the landing field, and she watched helplessly as Lauren's crew scrambled to pack up their equipment and load it onto their ship. Ash and Ember sensed her distress, and they climbed up to her balcony and pushed their heads against her, trying to comfort her. But even they could not reach her through the locked doors. Kira knew she had to warn Lauren about what was happening, and she had to let the captain know that her feelings were real and not just a moment of rebellion. She called Ash close to the balcony and whispered instructions to him, and the dragon understood because they had been together since he was a hatchling, and he knew her heart. Ash launched from the balcony and flew toward the landing field, and Kira watched as he landed near Lauren, and the captain looked up at the tower and seemed to understand. Lauren pulled out a small device from her pocket and touched it, and suddenly, Kira heard the captain's voice coming from a communicator that Lauren had given her the day before. Lauren said that she knew Kira was in trouble, and that her crew was being forced to leave, but that she would not go far, and that she would wait for word from Kira. Kira held the communicator close and said that she did not know what to do, because her father and Lord Valen were determined to maintain the old ways, and that she was just one person against an entire empire. Lauren's voice was steady and strong, and she said that every great change in history had started with one person who decided to stand up for what was right, and that Kira had that kind of courage. She told Kira to trust herself, and to trust the people who had been waiting for someone, to challenge the system, and that when the time came, Lauren and her crew would help in any way they could. Then the communicator went silent because Lauren's ship was lifting off, and Kira watched it rise into the sky and disappear beyond the clouds, and she felt more alone than she had ever felt. But she also felt something else, which was determination, because Lauren had believed in her and had shown her that another way was possible, and Kira decided that she would not marry Theron and would not let her father and the council continue to ignore the suffering of their people. Over the next few weeks, messengers brought news from the southern colonies, and Kira learned through her servants that the supplies Lauren's crew had delivered had saved hundreds of lives, but that the colonies were still struggling. She also learned that word had spread about the human visitors and about how they had treated even the lowest colonists with respect, and many people were asking why outsiders cared more about them than their own leaders did. Prince Theron arrived at the palace to meet his future bride, and Kira found him to be exactly what she expected, which was arrogant and cold and completely uninterested in anything except the political advantages their marriage would bring at a formal dinner. Theron spoke dismissively about the colonists and said that they should be grateful for whatever the capital chose to give them, and Kira felt anger rising in her chest. She challenged him and asked if he thought people in the colonies were less valuable than people in the capital, and Theron looked at her with surprise and said that obviously they were, because they were of lower birth. Lord Valen, who was present, smiled with approval at Theron's answer and said that the prince would make a fine king one day, because he understood the proper order of things. Kira excused herself from the dinner and returned to her chambers where Ash and Ember were waiting, and she told them that she could not go through with the marriage and that she had to find another way. That night she used the communicator to call Lauren and told her everything that had happened, and Lauren said that her ship was still in orbit around Eldraveth waiting for instructions. Kira said she needed help, but she did not know what kind of help because she could not fight her father's army, and she could not force the council to change their laws. Lauren was quiet for a moment, and then said that maybe Kira did not need to fight or force anything, and that maybe what she needed to do was show the people that another way was possible. She suggested that Kira use her position to start making small changes and to reach out to others who might feel the same way she did, and to build support slowly rather than trying to overturn everything at once. Kira realized that Lauren was right, and that she had allies she had not considered, which were the servants who worked in the palace and the guards, who came from common families, and the younger nobles who had traveled beyond the capital and seen how other provinces lived. She began to speak carefully to people she trusted, and she found that many of them shared her doubts about the empire but had been too afraid to voice them. A young guard captain named Vera told her privately that half the soldiers were from the colonies, and that they were angry about how their families had been treated. A kitchen servant named Mara said that the other servants talked about the human visitors and wished that someone would stand up to Lord Valen and his supporters. Even a few young nobles admitted that they questioned whether the old ways were truly the best ways, but they had no power to change. anything, Kira began to see that she was not alone and that there was a possibility for change if she could find the courage to lead it. And she knew that the time for that courage was coming soon. The day of Kira's wedding to Prince Theron arrived with great ceremony, and the Crystal Palace was decorated with flowers and banners, and nobles from across the empire had gathered to witness the union that would secure the Northern Alliance. Kira stood in her chambers wearing the traditional wedding gown made of silver silk and adorned with diamonds, but she felt like she was wearing chains instead of jewels. Her handmaidens helped her prepare, and several of them looked at her with sympathy, because the rumors had spread about her opposition to the marriage and about her friendship with the human captain. Mara, the kitchen servant, came in with a tray of food and whispered that many of the palace staff were on her side, and that whatever she decided to do, they would support her. Kira thanked her and felt some of her courage return because she knew now that she was not fighting alone. Guards came to escort her to the throne room where the ceremony would take place, and as she walked through the palace corridors, she saw servants and guards watching her with expressions that seemed to say they were waiting for her to do something. Lord Valen was waiting near the throne room entrance, and he smiled at her with satisfaction and said that soon she would be properly married and would forget all these foolish ideas about equality and change. Kira looked him in the eye and said that she would never forget, and that the empire was built on injustice, and that one day it would fall. His smile vanished, and he grabbed her arm roughly and said that she would go through with this wedding, or she would be stripped of her title and imprisoned, and that he would make sure anyone who supported her would face the same fate. But before Kira could respond, Ash and Ember appeared in the corridor, having sensed her distress, and they positioned themselves between her and Lord Valen, and the elder released her arm quickly, because even he was not foolish enough to threaten someone protected by dragons. Kira entered the throne room with Ash and Ember following close behind, and she saw hundreds of nobles seated in rows watching her, and at the front of the room stood Prince Theron looking impatient beside her father, the king. The ceremony began with traditional words spoken by the high priest, and Kira was supposed to respond with vows of obedience and loyalty, but when the moment came, she remained silent. The priest looked confused and repeated the question, and still Kira said nothing, and the throne room began to fill with whispers. Her father stood up from his throne and demanded that she speak her vows, and Lord Valen moved toward her with clear intent to force her compliance. But Kira raised her hand, and her voice rang out clear and strong through the throne room, and she said that she would not marry Prince Theron, and that she could not in good conscience support an empire that valued power over justice. The room erupted in shocked gasps and angry shouts, and Prince Theron's face turned red with rage, and he said that she had insulted him and his kingdom, and that there would be consequences. King Aldrich looked at his daughter with disbelief and pain, and he asked her how she could betray her duty, and her family and everything she had been raised to honor. Kira met her father's eyes and said that she loved him, but that she could not betray the people who suffered under their rule, and that she had seen what leadership could be when it was based on compassion instead of hierarchy. Lord Valen ordered the guards to seize her, and several of them moved forward. But then Vera, the young guard captain, stepped in front of Kira and said that she would not arrest the princess for speaking truth. Other guards joined Vera, and suddenly half the guards in the room were standing between Kira and those who would harm her. The throne room descended into chaos, with nobles shouting and guards choosing sides, and Prince Theron demanding that order be restored. Then a voice rang out from the entrance, and everyone turned to see Lauren Hayes walking into the throne room with her crew behind her and several dozen colonists who had traveled from the southern provinces. Lauren said that she had been monitoring the situation, and that when she heard what was happening, she knew she had to come, and she apologized for interrupting, but said that the people of Eldraveth deserved to hear what was being decided about their future. Lord Valen shouted that she had no right to be here, and that she was an outsider who had corrupted the princess, and that she should be arrested immediately. But Lauren walked calmly to stand beside Kira, and she said that she had not corrupted anyone, and that Princess Kira had simply learned to question systems that caused suffering. One of the colonists stepped forward, and he was Elder Mira's son named Thomas, and he said that the humans had saved his mother's life, and that they had shown more care for the colonies in 3 days than the capital had shown in 3 years. Other colonists spoke up, and they told stories of neglect and hardship, and how they had been ignored by the nobles who claimed to rule them. Some of the younger nobles looked uncomfortable because they had never heard these stories before, and they began to realize that perhaps the Empire was not as just as they had believed. Mara and other servants emerged from the side doors, and they added their voices saying that they too had been treated poorly and that they wanted change. King Aldrich looked around at the chaos, and he seemed to shrink in his throne because he was seeing his kingdom fracture before his eyes. Lord Valen, however, was not defeated, and he shouted that this was rebellion and that everyone who supported the princess would be punished, and he called for loyal guards to arrest both Kira and Lauren. A group of guards loyal to Valen moved forward with weapons drawn, and for a moment it seemed that blood would be spilled in the throne room. But then Ash and Ember roared with such force that the entire palace shook, and they spread their wings to their full span, creating a barrier that no one dared cross. Kira stepped forward and said that she did not want violence, and that she was not trying to destroy the Empire but to transform it. She proposed that instead of rule by birthright, they create a council with representatives from every province and every class, where decisions would be made together rather than imposed from above. Many of the nobles rejected this idea immediately, but Kira noticed that some of the younger ones seemed intrigued, and several of the colonists and servants were nodding with enthusiasm. Prince Theron declared that he wanted nothing to do with this madness and that he was returning to the northern kingdoms, and that the alliance was broken. King Aldrich seemed to age before everyone's eyes, and he said quietly that perhaps he had been wrong about many things, but that he did not know how to fix what had been broken. Kira approached her father's throne and knelt before him, and said that she still loved him and still honored him, but that she could not continue to support a system that caused such pain. The king looked at Lauren and asked if the humans had really shown such care for the colonies, and Lauren said that they had simply treated people with basic dignity, which should not be revolutionary, but apparently was Lord Valen, made one final attempt to rally support, and he said that anyone who followed the princess would be branded a traitor. But his words fell flat because too many people had already chosen their side. Vera ordered the guards loyal to Valen to stand down, and most of them did because they realized they were outnumbered, and that fighting would only lead to more suffering. That evening, after hours of heated discussion, a tentative agreement was reached, and King Aldrich would remain as a symbolic leader, but real power would be transferred to a new council, with representatives chosen by the people. Lord Valen and his closest supporters were given the choice to accept the new system or leave the capital, and most of them chose to leave, taking their wealth and influence to the northern provinces. Kira and Lauren stood together on the palace balcony, watching the twin suns set, and Kira said she could not believe that the day had actually worked out. Lauren laughed and said that revolution was never clean or easy, but that what mattered was that real change had begun. Kira asked what would happen next, and Lauren said that building a new government would take time and patience, and that there would be setbacks and difficulties, but she also said that Kira had proven she had the courage to lead, and that the people who mattered most had chosen to follow her. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and then Kira asked if Lauren would stay to help them through the transition. Lauren smiled and said that her crew's mission was to explore and make contact, but that she thought exploring new forms of government was just as important as exploring new worlds. She said they would stay as long as they were needed, and as long as Kira wanted them there. Kira took Lauren's hand and said that she wanted her to stay for a very long time, and Lauren pulled her close and kissed her, while Ash and Ember watched over them, and the first stars began to appear in the evening sky. The months following the disrupted wedding were among the most challenging and most rewarding of Kira's life, because building a new government from the ruins of an ancient empire proved to be even more difficult than she had imagined. The first council meeting was held in what had been the throne room, but the thrones had been removed and replaced with a large circular table where representatives from every province and every class could sit as equals. Elder Mira came from the southern colonies along with farmers and workers who had never imagined they would have a voice in government, and young nobles like Vera who wanted to see their world change sat beside servants like Mara, who had spent their lives being invisible. Lauren attended the meetings as an observer and advisor, and her crew helped set up systems for communication and record-keeping that would allow even the most distant provinces to participate in decisions. The early meetings were chaotic because people who had never been allowed to speak their minds suddenly had the freedom to do so, and old resentments and grievances poured out. Some of the remaining nobles argued that the lower classes were not educated enough to make important decisions, and representatives from the colonies argued that the nobles had proven their education meant nothing when it came to compassion or wisdom. Kira found herself mediating disputes and working to find common ground, and there were many nights when she collapsed into bed exhausted and wondering if this experiment would fail. But Lauren was always there to encourage her and to remind her that change was supposed to be hard and that anything worth doing required struggle and sacrifice. Slowly progress was made, and the new council passed laws that redistributed resources more fairly and established rights for workers and servants and created schools in the provinces so that education would no longer be a privilege of the wealthy King Aldrich. Watched all of this from the sidelines, and at first he was bitter and withdrawn. But gradually Kira saw him begin to understand why these changes were necessary. One evening he asked to speak with her privately, and he told her that he was proud of her courage even though it had cost him his power, and he admitted that he had been blind to the suffering of his people. Kira embraced her father and said that she had never wanted to hurt him, but that she could not ignore what she had learned, and he said he understood and that perhaps old men like him needed to step aside so that new leaders could build better worlds. Not everyone accepted the changes peacefully, and Lord Valen had established himself in the northern provinces and was gathering supporters who wanted to restore the old empire. He sent messages claiming that Kira had betrayed her people by allying with outsiders and that the humans were secretly planning to conquer Eldraveth. Some people believed these messages, and there were protests in several cities and a few violent incidents where supporters of the old ways attacked council representatives. Kira knew they had to address these concerns, and she proposed that Lauren and her crew give public presentations about the Human Federation and show people that cooperation between species did not mean conquest. Lauren agreed, and they traveled to different provinces with Ash and Ember flying overhead as both guards and symbols of the new government in town, squares and meeting halls. Lauren explained how the Human Federation worked and how it respected the sovereignty of each world, while encouraging trade and cultural exchange. She showed them technology that could improve agriculture and medicine, and she emphasized that humans were offering help, not demanding control. Riley, the ship's doctor, worked with local healers to train them in new medical techniques, and Megan helped set up communication networks that connected isolated communities. Kevin taught engineers about clean energy systems, and Janet organized trade networks that allowed provinces to exchange goods without going through the capital Carlos. Meanwhile, helped train security forces that would protect the new government from those who wanted to destroy it. Slowly, public opinion began to shift, and more people saw that the humans were genuine in their desire to help, and that the changes Kira was making were improving their lives. But Lord Valen was not finished, and he gathered an army in the northern provinces and declared that he would march on the capital and restore the rightful order. Kira received word of this threat and called an emergency council meeting to decide how to respond. Some representatives wanted to raise an army and meet Valen's forces in battle, but Kira argued that violence would only create more division and suffering. Lauren suggested that instead of fighting, they should invite Valen and his supporters to come to the capital and see the changes for themselves and participate in the new government if they were willing. Many council members thought this was naive, but Kira decided to try, and she sent a message to Valen offering him safe passage and a seat on the council if he would put aside his weapons. Valen's response was contemptuous, and he said that he would never bow to a council of commoners, and that he would take the capital by force. His army marched south, and Kira's advisors urged her to prepare defenses, but she refused to turn the Crystal Palace into a fortress. Instead, she ordered that the gates remain open, and that anyone who wanted to enter could do so peacefully. When Valen's army arrived at the capital, they found no walls or barricades, and the streets were filled with citizens going about their daily business. Valen led his soldiers through the gates expecting resistance but finding none, and the citizens watched them pass with curiosity rather than fear. Kira met Valen in the central square with Lauren beside her and Ash and Ember resting nearby, and she invited him to see what the new government had accomplished. She took him through hospitals where people from all classes received free care, and schools where children from poor families learned alongside noble children. She showed him markets where trade was thriving, and neighborhoods where former servants now owned their own homes and businesses. Valen tried to remain unmoved, but his soldiers were talking with the citizens and hearing stories of improvement and opportunity. That evening, Kira invited Valen and his officers to a feast, where they sat with council representatives and colonists, and heard directly from people whose lives had changed. One of Valen's officers was a young woman named Catherine, who came from a minor noble family, and she asked the council members if they truly believed this new system was better. Elder Mira answered and said that for the first time in her long life, she felt like her voice mattered and that her children had hope for a better future. Mara spoke about how she had gone from being a servant to running her own bakery, and how her daughter was learning to read and write. Vera talked about how the security forces now protected all citizens equally, instead of just enforcing the will of the powerful. Catherine listened carefully and then turned to Lord Valen and said that perhaps they had been wrong about the rebellion and that perhaps change was not the disaster they had feared. Other officers nodded in agreement, and Valen realized that he was losing the support of his own army. Over the following days, more of Valen's soldiers chose to stay in the capital rather than return north, and many of them requested permission to join the new security forces or to settle in the city. Valen himself remained defiant, but he was a leader without followers, and finally he agreed to meet privately with Kira. She told him that she understood his fear of change and his attachment to the old ways, but that holding on to the past was preventing him from seeing the possibilities of the future. She offered him again a position on the council, where his experience and knowledge could be valuable if he was willing to work within the new system. Valen was silent for a long time, and then he said that he was too old to change, and that the world Kira was building was not one where he belonged. He asked only that he be allowed to retire to his estates in the north and live out his remaining years in peace. Kira granted his request, and Valen departed the next morning with a small group of loyal retainers. And though he never accepted the new government, he also never again tried to overthrow it. With the threat of civil war ended, the council turned its attention to building lasting institutions and creating trade relationships with other provinces and even other worlds. Lauren's Federation sent official representatives to establish diplomatic relations, and soon ships from other species were visiting Eldraveth and exchanging knowledge and goods. Kira found that governing was harder than she had imagined, but also more fulfilling, because every day she saw evidence that their work was making life better for ordinary people. She and Lauren built a life together that scandalized some traditionalists, but inspired many others, especially young people who saw them as proof that love could transcend boundaries of species and tradition. Ash and Ember grew older, and eventually one spring morning Ash laid a clutch of eggs, and Kira realized that new dragons would soon join them, and that this new generation would grow up in a very different world than she had. Years passed, and the changes that had seemed so radical at first became normal, and children grew up not knowing any other system and assuming that representation and equality were natural rights. King Aldrich lived long enough to see his granddaughter born and to hold the child, who would grow up in a world he had helped create, even if it was not the world he had imagined. On his deathbed, he told Kira that she had been right, and that he was grateful she had been brave enough to challenge him.